All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we take deep dives into great theories of everything and try to figure out how to use them in our own lives. Today is our 582nd video that we've done on Dewey B. Larson's reciprocal system of theory. Mr. Larson proposed the two fundamental postulates of his reciprocal system back in 1959. And then over the next 30 years, the remaining 30 years of his life, he put together a number of books on physics and chemistry, astronomy, also metaphysics, and also economics. He has two books on economics. We are looking at the second one today, that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. We're in chapter 25 of that book, called Stabilization Methods number 2. And I apologize, I kind of ran out of time yesterday for the cold exit there. But we'll go back a paragraph and start up again, try to get this chapter finished. Now, just to give you a little bit more information on the reciprocal system, it is, I would say, the first generalized theory out there. It's been ignored. Hardly anybody knows anything about it. That's why I will eventually be a famous person, not because of anything that I've done, but simply because I've recorded 582 videos on the reciprocal system, and at a certain point people are going to wake up and figure out that this is where it's at, and this person has the answers to all the questions. He at least has the questions and proposes many answers. He, as Larson says, the theory itself is correct. Whether I've applied the theory correctly is another question. So, Larson's got the right theory. Now, he doesn't always apply it correctly. But if he doesn't, his associates or people in the future will kind of correct it in as they see that it is inconsistent with the postulates. Really, the first postulate, that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And so the universe is made out of motion. Motion is the relationship between space and time. That is a reciprocal relationship. All of our scientific entities are nothing but relationships between space and time, fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. Space and time can come in multiple dimensions, and space and time do not exist in and of themselves. They only exist together in motion. You can abstract one or the other, but by doing so, you're stopping the universe. And the universe is a universe in motion. So when you do abstract, you are no longer getting the full picture. When Larson is talking about motion, he's specifically or generally talking about what he calls scalar motion. Scalar motion is a motion that has a magnitude but has no specific direction. You can envision a scalar motion using a balloon that you put dots on with a magic marker. As you blow up the balloon, all the dots are moving away from each other. Every dot is moving away from every other dot, meaning that every dot is moving in every direction. There is no specific direction attached to any of that movement. It's either out or in. If you contract the balloon, it's in. Now, the outward movement of that balloon, Larson calls the progression. When that outward movement occurs at the speed of 1 unit of space per 1 unit of time, otherwise known as the speed of light, then he calls it the progression of the natural reference system. And this progression of the natural reference system is omnipresent and eternal. It is always occurring in all times, all places. That is basically the water that us fish are in. We cannot perceive the progression, just like we can't perceive water if we are a fish, because it's omnipresent. And so the progression, even though it is pulling us apart at the rate of the speed of light in all directions, we can't feel it. But it is the source for all of everything that comes after it. But that source is not harnessed until it is reversed. And that reversal needs to be in 3 dimensions. And that then would result in the inward motion of the balloon, where everything is moving toward each other. Larson refers to that as gravitation, and that is where we get manifestation. Now, all of the scientific stuff, is well and good within the context of Larson's books on physics and chemistry and so on. But he also, like I said, we are focused on his books on economics right now. Larson posits an economic system in motion. And that economic system has 2 reciprocal aspects, which are production and consumption. And by applying scientific principles to the economic system, Larson is able to basically chart out a flow of 2 flows of the economic system. One of purchasing power and the other of goods. And these are the 2 basic resultants of production and consumption. And Larson arrives at 17 fundamental principles that he applies to the economic system that are mathematically exact, and then is able to propose methods to basically tamp down the wild fluctuations of booms and busts of the economic system, so that the economic system is always humming and that it is leading to permanent prosperity. Now, his other book on economics is called The Road to Full Employment. Larson maintains that the methods that you use to address the employment situation are independent of the methods that are needed to, tamp down the booms and busts, to leave the room for permanent prosperity. So he has 2 books, and both of them need to be used. Okay, we're going to, if you have, curiosity and want to get into more of the reciprocal system, watch some of my first 474 videos on the subject, so that each one of them has a description of the fundamental postulates and their ramifications and their consequences and their derivation into, whatever aspect of the reciprocal system. I've gone over several of his books in those videos. And then this book here, The Road to Permanent Prosperity, I started about 8 weeks ago. And you can go back and start with chapter 1 there. But right now we're in chapter 25 out of 26. So we're getting close to the end. So let's start up here, back up one paragraph from yesterday, and get into the second half of the chapter 25 on stabilization methods. In the period from 1922 to 1927, the open market powers were used on several occasions with uniformly favorable results, and the banking authorities became convinced that they had found at least a partial answer to their stabilization problems. The 1929 action, however, was not well timed and accentuated an inflationary tendency already underway. As a result, the sale of securities had to be undertaken in 1928 and 1929 to stem the rising tide of speculation and inflation. But to the dismay of those who had regarded the open market operation so optimistically, this action had little apparent effect, even though it was carried to the point where the supply of securities on hand was practically exhausted. After the stock market crash in the fall of 1929, buying was begun, and large purchases were made throughout most of the decline, again with little or no visible results. As expressed by W. Randolph Burgess of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, from 1922 to 1927, the response to relatively small changes in Federal Reserve policy were extraordinary, but in 1928-29 and later, the most vigorous measures had relatively little effect. End quote. In order to appreciate what happened and why the operations were effective at one time and ineffective at another, it must first be understood just what the open market operations do to the economic system in general. The bankers, accustomed to looking at the situation from the standpoint of the technicalities of their own business, regard these operations as a means of credit control, and so label them in their financial discussions. As they see the picture, purchase of securities by the Federal Reserve expands the reserve of the member banks, whereas reversing the process contracts those reserves. The effect, according to this view, is to make the bankers either more or less willing to lend. But we who are investigating the reactions of the economic mechanism as a whole are not interested for the present in these interbank relations. From the standpoint of the general economy, the entire banking system is one unit. An increase in bank reserves is an increase in the amount of money storage in the banks. But if this increase is the result of a transaction by which a corresponding decrease occurs in the amount of money in storage in the Federal Reserve banks, the net total change in money storage is zero, and there is no effect at all on the general economy. The open market operations are effective as inflationary or deflationary measures only to the extent that these transactions do not affect the bank reserves. That is, to the extent that the securities are bought from or sold to non-bank investors, directly or indirectly. The principle here is the same as that involved in government borrowing. Sale of bonds to non-bank purchasers soaks up excess money purchasing power. Sale to the banks does not. In the non-bank transactions, additional credit goods, government bonds, are introduced into the goods stream, while the money purchasing power stream remains unchanged. Market prices that fall or are prevented from rising in response to inflationary forces. Let me read that sentence again. Market prices then fall or are prevented from rising in response to inflationary forces. These operations in the open market, excluding purely interbank transactions, are a means of accomplishing the same kind of a result, or the reverse, by a transfer between credit goods and credit money. Credit goods, government securities, are withdrawn from storage and exchanged in the market for credit money, which in turn is put into storage or retired from circulation. In the reverse transaction, credit money is withdrawn from storage, new currency is issued, and it is exchanged in the market for credit goods. The latter then go back into storage. By this means, the current stream of money purchasing power is increased or decreased relative to the stream of goods, without altering any other economic relation except the form of a portion of the national debt outstanding. Here is a very simple and effective tool for controlling the economy. If stabilization is undertaken as a continuous process, the net excess of transactions to be counterbalanced by the open market operations will never be very large, as each small deviation in one direction or the other can be nipped in the bud by the appropriate action. The key to successful control is a clear understanding of just what is to be done, and a close watch on the relevant data to make certain that action is taken promptly when needed. Heretofore, the Federal Reserve authorities have neither recognized the true effect of the operations on the business cycle, nor possessed an adequate guide as to when action should be taken, or as to the magnitude of the operations required. As a result, there has been no action at all until the unbalance has become large enough to be plainly visible. And when action finally has been taken, the operations have conformed to a set pattern, rather than being adapted to the quantitative requirements of the existing situation. This explains the seeming discrepancy between the 1922 to 1927 results and the subsequent experience, when the open market operations were first placed on a definite policy basis. The magnitude of the individual operations was arbitrarily set at a figure from $200 to $500 million for lack of any accurate method of determining the actual requirements. In the 1922 to 1927 period, no strong trend in either direction developed in the money and credit reservoirs, and open market operations of this size were therefore adequate not only to neutralize the net transactions into or out of the reservoirs, but were also sufficient to give the general economy a momentum in the opposite direction. In 1928 and 1929, the picture was entirely different. Now, the nation was in the midst of a speculative boom, with money purchasing power flowing out of the consumer money and credit reservoirs in a veritable flood. The transactions that were ample to counterbalance the small streams that issued from the reservoirs in the previous years were of no avail against this tremendous volume. It was just another case of sending a boy to do a man's work. The same comments apply to the situation after the 1929 collapse, with additional emphasis. The failure of this program to stem the money inflation of 1928 to 1929 and the subsequent deflation was not due to any defect in the method itself. It was merely a matter of too little and too late, the employment of mild and gentle measures where only action of truly epic proportions would suffice. It is very common for the advocates of an unsuccessful economic program to try to explain away the failure by the assertion that the program was not applied on a large enough scale, and there may possibly be some suspicion that the foregoing explanation is the same kind of an excuse. By referring to the discussion of business cycles in Chapter 14, however, it can be seen that the reservoir theory therein explained definitely requires the corrective operations to be equal in magnitude to the net excess of consumer transactions in order to have the desired effect. The quantitative aspect of the action, not too much and not too little, is the essence of the program. From the statistical records of the movement of money and credit, it is apparent that the 1922 to 1927 open market operations were adequate to meet this requirement, whereas the operations in 1929 and the following years were far below the necessary level, not because they were smaller, but because the reservoir unbalance was vastly greater. This is not the kind of a situation where a partial action does some good. The decline can be slowed by measures of less than the magnitude required for neutralization of the reservoir transactions. But it cannot be halted because the storage of money and the contraction of credit are fully balanced by the control operations. Slowing the rate of decline is of no particular value. It probably does more harm by prolonging the depression than it does good in any other respect. Anything short of the full amount needed to restore equilibrium is useless. Obviously, the Federal Reserve operations during the 1928-29 boom and the following depression, large as they seem when judged by normal standards, were trivial in comparison with the coincident huge unbalanced transactions in and out of the consumer money and credit reservoirs. The lessons to be learned from this experience are, first, that speculative excesses should not be permitted to get a start, and second, that the stabilization program should be automatic and continuous so that no inflationary boom or deflationary recession will have a chance to get beyond the point where it can be handled effectively by ordinary means. If the wild swings due to speculation are curbed, bank credit is carefully watched, and foreign trade is subjected to some intelligent control, there is no doubt but that the minor ups and downs that will still occur can be ironed out by a small but continuous program of open market operations. All that is necessary is that the Federal Reserve keeps fully informed as to the current status of the purchasing power reservoirs and balances any net inflow or outflow promptly by open market operations of the opposite character and exactly the same amounts. The result of such a program will be to maintain the price balance between production and the markets and to ensure a flow of money purchasing power to the markets that will be just sufficient to buy the full volume of goods produced at the full production price. It will not mean a constant market price level. On the contrary, Any changes at the production end of the economic mechanism, either because of altered tax or wage rates, or because of technological improvements, will be promptly reflected in the market price level. But such variations have no adverse effect on the general economy. The stabilization of the flow of money purchasing power will eliminate the destructive price fluctuations, those due to an unbalance between production, volume, and active money purchasing power. As indicated in the preceding chapter, it will be advisable to authorize and set up a tax adjustment program to be held in reserve for use when and if there is a heavy surge in the system, which the open market operations might have difficulty handling. Probably this program will never be needed, except perhaps in getting the stabilization program started, but there are some limitations on what can be done by the interchange of credit goods and credit money. And as long as a tool that is essentially unlimited is available, it is good insurance to have this tool ready for prompt use in case of an emergency. Actually, the fact that it is available will go a long way toward eliminating the possibility that it may be needed. The stabilization program that is here being recommended leaves business and government free to operate in almost all respects just as they would in the absence of such economic controls. Nevertheless, it is impossible to set up a program of this kind without affecting something. If the open market operations are to be used as the primary means of economic control, then they cannot be used for other purposes. The particular significance of this point lies in the fact that these operations are currently being used for other purposes. One action that has frequently been taken is to buy government securities at appropriate times as a means of supporting the price of those securities. That is, keeping the interest rate artificially low to hold down the cost of government financing. In order to make the open market operations available for control purposes, these support purchases will have to be discontinued. Since this will increase the amount of interest that has to be paid on the national debt, there will undoubtedly be some opposition to discontinuing this price support, particularly from the Treasury Department, which is quite legitimately concerned with keeping the interest cost as low as possible. If we assume for the moment that holding the interest rate down is a worthwhile objective, and that the cost of government financing will be substantially increased if the price support actions are no longer taken, the question becomes, is stabilization of the economy at a permanent high level worth enough to justify this increase in interest costs? There cannot be any doubt as to the answer to this question. The added interest costs are only a drop in the bucket compared to the losses that are now being incurred by reason of the economic fluctuations of the business cycle. But in reality, holding down the interest rates on the government debt is not as desirable an objective as it appears to be on superficial examination. When we examine the situation more closely, it becomes evident that the low interest policy does not actually reduce the cost to those who pay the bills, the taxpayers. The artificially low interest rate is made possible only by creating new money for the Federal Reserve banks to use in buying government securities to support their prices. Injection of this new money into the purchasing power stream automatically raises the market price level, and the taxpayer pays out in higher prices all that the lower interest rate saves on his taxes. Behind all of this machinery by which it is carried out, this management of the interest rate is simply another attempt to get something for nothing, and it shares the fate of all other schemes of this nature. In recent years, the most significant use of the monetary tools of the Federal Reserve System, including the open market operations, has been to manipulate the interest rate as a means of combating inflation. As pointed out earlier, this is a prime example of economic mismanagement. We create cost inflation by adopting a labor policy that imposes no significant restraints on wage increases, and then deal with the cost inflation due to these increases by choking business with high interest rates to create the unemployment that will bring the wage rates back down. One of the prerequisites for constructing a workable program to stabilize business is to recognize that such a program should be directed against money inflation only. Cost inflation has no major effect on the general economic situation. It does create inequities among different classes of workers and therefore deserves some attention, but this is a totally different problem which should not be permitted to confuse the stabilization issue. Thus, the fact that we will have to discontinue the open market operations for these other purposes in order to make them available as the principal tool of the stabilization program is not an argument against the program. These other uses should be discontinued in any event, as they do not benefit the economy. Where they have any effect at all, it is harmful. Okay, that is the end of Chapter 25, Stabilization Methods 2. And that is where Larson articulates the general idea about injecting and or withdrawing money from the purchasing power stream in order to stabilize the economy from its booms and bust, the amplitude of the curve up and down. All right, now we're headed toward his final chapter here in this book, chapter 26, Comments and Recommendations. We will start that chapter tomorrow when we resume, and then after that we're going to have to figure out where we're going. But I do believe we're going in the direction of, I won't say religion, meditation, God, maybe that. Okay. We'll figure it out. But in the meantime, thanks for tuning in today, and have